He bought her for a handful of coins, tied to a post like a stray dog behind a saloon, spitting dust in the dying Arizona sun. But he had no idea what he was really buying. Her name was Ida, and she was 18 years old, though the look in her eyes was ancient. Bruised, barefoot, and baked in grime, she'd given up on fighting weeks ago. Men shuffled past, spitting tobacco juice near her feet, laughing at some cruel joke only they understood. She didn't flinch. The numbness was a kind of armor. The saloon doors screamed open, and a man named Frank Lick, her stepfather, staggered out into the copper-colored light. He stank of cheap whiskey and cheaper morals. "She stays there till I get my money," he slurred to the world, a proclamation of ownership that made Ida's stomach clench into a cold, hard knot. He'd lost at cards, and she was the price. His debt paid in flesh. That's when the quiet sound of hooves cut through the noise. A man rode in slow astride a black gelding that moved with the certainty of its rider. He was broad-shouldered, his face a road map of hard years and harsh sun, hidden mostly by the brim of a worn-out hat. He looked like a man who was used to silence, a man the silence respected. His name was Calder Boone. He didn't dismount. He just stopped, his presence a sudden, heavy weight in the street. Frank Lick narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" he barked, his voice thick with belligerence. Calder's voice was low, like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a dry riverbed. "That girl," Frank sneered, "ain't for sale. She's payment." Calder didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a leather pouch, and the soft clink of coins was louder than any gunshot in the sudden quiet. "3 times what you lost," he said, and tossed the pouch into the dirt between them. It landed with a dull thud, a punctuation mark on the end of Frank's ownership. Frank just stared, his drunken mind trying to catch up. Calder dismounted then, slow, deliberate. Each movement was measured, wasting nothing. He walked right past Frank, right to where Ida hung limp against the post. He pulled a knife from his belt, not a fighting knife, but a working tool, worn and honest. With one clean slice, he cut the ropes. They fell away like dead snakes. Ada didn't move. She just blinked at the dust, her body still expecting the bite of the rope. Calder held out a hand. It was calloused, rough, but steady. She looked at it, then up at the shadows on his face. There was no pity in his eyes, no kindness, nothing at all, just an unsettling emptiness. She took his hand, her small trembling fingers engulfed by his. He led her to a pack mule tethered nearby and helped her up. She moved like an automaton, without a word, without a question. "You can't just take her," Frank bellowed from behind them, his courage returning now that the money was on the ground. "There are laws." Calder didn't look back. He just swung himself onto his horse and started riding out of Dustel, the mule trotting obediently behind. The lights of the saloon faded. The voices vanished. The world behind them dissolved into quiet. After what felt like an hour, Ida finally spoke, her voice a dry rasp. "Are you going to sell me to someone else?" Calder rode on, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "No." A beat of silence. Hoof falls on the hard-packed earth. "Are you going to hit me if I fall asleep?" "No." Her voice dropped to a whisper, so faint it was nearly stolen by the wind. "Will you lock me up?" He was quiet for a long moment, the silence stretching out until it was thin and sharp. Then he spoke, his voice carrying back to her, flat and cold and utterly devoid of comfort. "There ain't a lock on my place." She thought it was a promise of freedom. She was wrong. It was a statement of fact about a place so isolated, so desolate, that locks were an irrelevance. A prison doesn't need a key when the walls are 100 miles of empty desert in every direction. Her heart, which had dared to flutter with a fragile hope, sank back into the cold, familiar dark. She hadn't been rescued. She had just been moved. The trail to Calder Boone's ranch was long and unforgiving. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised twilight that offered no comfort. Ida rode in a stupor, the rhythmic sway of the mule the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. When the cabin finally came into view, it was less a home and more a scar on the land. A sagging porch, a crumbling chimney, a roof that looked like it had lost a fight with the wind and just given up. It was impossibly quiet. The kind of quiet that buzzes in your ears and makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. Calder dismounted and helped her down. His touch was firm, impersonal, and over as quickly as it began. He led her inside, and the desolation followed them. The cabin was a single, stark room, a stove in the corner, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall covered with a faded quilt. Everything was worn, stripped down to its most basic function. There were no pictures, no decorations, no sign that a life was actually lived here. It was a place for surviving, not living. He gestured to a chair, then disappeared out a back door. He returned with a tin cup of water and a slab of dry bread with a sliver of cheese. He set it on the table in front of her. No words. He sat opposite her, drinking his own water, his eyes shadowed by his hat, watching, always watching. She ate slowly, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the bread. Each bite was a struggle, her throat tight with fear. This was worse than Frank's place. The violence there was loud and predictable. This silence. This was a different kind of monster. It was a waiting game, and she didn't know the rules. When she finished, she whispered, "Thank you." He just nodded. Later, he brought a basin of warm water and set it by the hearth with a clean rag. He didn't have to say what it was for. He just turned and said, "I'll be outside." He left, closing the door softly behind him, but she knew he was out there, listening. She washed away the layers of grime and dried blood, the water turning a murky brown. The simple act felt alien, a luxury she hadn't been afforded in months. He'd left a clean linen shirt on the bed, far too big for her, but it was soft against her raw skin. When she was done, she found him already on a cot near the window, his hat over his face, a silent sentinel in the dark. Where do I sleep?" she asked, her voice trembling. He pointed a finger from under his hat toward the main bed. "That's yours." She hesitated, her feet rooted to the spot. "The door." "There ain't a lock," he repeated, his voice muffled by the felt. She crept to the bed and slid under the quilt, pulling it up to her chin like a shield. She lay there rigid, listening for the sound of his footsteps, for the creak of the door, for the click of a lock that wasn't there. But all she heard was the wind moaning outside and the quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind raced. Why bring her here? Why pay for her? The emptiness of the cabin felt wrong. It wasn't just simple living. It was erased, as if someone had meticulously removed all traces of personality, of joy. Hours passed. Calder didn't move. Finally, unable to bear the suffocating uncertainty, she slipped out of bed. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor. She had learned to move like a ghost. She crept through the small space, her eyes adjusting to the deep shadows. There was the main door, the back door he'd used earlier, and another door, tucked away in the darkest corner of the cabin. It was different from the others. It was made of newer, thicker wood, and set into its frame was a heavy iron lock. A brand new one. His words echoed in her mind. "There ain't a lock on my place," he had lied. A cold dread, colder than any desert night, washed over her. The silence of the cabin wasn't peace. It was a tomb. And this man, this quiet, watchful stranger, wasn't her savior. He was her keeper. And whatever was behind that locked door was the reason why. For 3 days, Ida existed in a state of suspended terror. She moved through the cabin like a phantom, sweeping floors that were already clean, wiping a table that held nothing but dust. She fed the handful of chickens he kept, her hands trembling as she scattered the grain. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the quiet facade to shatter and reveal the monster underneath. Calder remained an enigma. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending to his horse, his movements economical and purposeful. He spoke only when necessary, his words like stones dropped into a deep well. "There's water in the barrel. The fire needs wood." They ate their meals in the same crushing silence, his gaze resting on her, unreadable, unnerving. The locked door loomed in her mind, a dark promise of a truth she was terrified to uncover. What was in there? A previous girl? A torture chamber? Her imagination, fed by years of abuse, conjured horrors that made her skin crawl. The lie about the lock was a cancer, eating away at the tiny sliver of hope she'd allowed herself. On the third night, she couldn't take it anymore. Calder was outside, a faint silhouette against the star-dusted horizon, checking on the horse. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Now was her chance. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She crept to the corner, her fingers tracing the cold iron of the lock. It was a simple padlock, the kind you'd see on a stable. She remembered watching Frank's cronies pick locks with a piece of wire. Her hands shook, but desperation was a powerful teacher. She found a thin, sturdy piece of wire she'd saved from a broken broom and knelt before the door. Her breath hitched in her throat. This was insane. If he caught her, she pushed the thought away. Not knowing was worse. She inserted the wire, her fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. She twisted it, feeling for the tumblers, her ears straining for the slightest click. Nothing. She tried again. The metal scraped. A horse nickered outside. He was coming back. Panic seized her. She fumbled with the wire, ready to give up when she felt it. A tiny give. A soft click. The lock sprang open. For a moment she just knelt there, her hand on the cold metal, her heart a deafening drum. She pulled the lock free and slowly, carefully, eased the heavy wooden door open. It swung inward without a sound, revealing not darkness, but a room bathed in the soft, silvery light of the moon, filtering through a small, grimy window. Her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. It wasn't a prison. It wasn't a place of horror. It was a nursery. A small wooden crib stood against the far wall, a handmade mobile of carved birds hanging motionless above it. A tiny rocking horse, its paint faded and chipped, sat in the corner. On a small dresser, a stack of neatly folded baby clothes lay next to a silverback brush. The room was frozen in time, coated in a thin layer of dust but otherwise perfectly preserved. It was a shrine to a life that had never been lived, a room drowning in a silence far deeper and more painful than the one in the rest of the cabin. This wasn't the lair of a monster, it was the tomb of a broken heart. "What are you doing?" The voice came from behind her, low and dead. Ida spun around, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Calder stood in the doorway, his face a mask of stone in the flickering firelight. But his eyes, for the first time, she saw something in them besides emptiness. She saw a pain so vast and deep it was like looking into an abyss. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her, into the room, and the sight of it seemed to shatter something inside him. The stone mask crumbled, and what was left was the raw, unguarded agony of a man who had lost everything. "Get out!" he whispered, his voice cracking. She backed away, stumbling over her own feet. He strode past her, his movements stiff and jerky. He reached the door of the nursery, and with a guttural cry that sounded like it was ripped from his very soul, he slammed it shut. He fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking, and snapped it back into place, sealing the ghost-filled room away once more. He turned to face her, his broad shoulders slumped, his breathing ragged. He looked utterly defeated. "Her name was Clara," he said, his voice a raw rasp. "My wife." He gestured vaguely toward the locked door. "We were expecting a son. We were going to name him Eli." Ada stood motionless. The truth of the cabin, of this man crashing down on her. The emptiness, the silence, the lack of any personal touch. It wasn't a choice. It was a scar. He hadn't built a prison for her. He was living in one himself. "The fever took them both," he continued, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the past. "Took her in 2 days. The baby. He never even took a breath." He finally looked at Ida, his eyes swimming with a grief so profound it was almost terrifying to witness. "I locked that door because I couldn't bear to look at it. And I lied because it's none of your business. It's my pain, not yours." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or menacing. It was heavy, filled with the ghosts of a woman named Clara and a boy named Eli. Ida understood now. He hadn't saved her out of kindness or pity. He had seen a flicker of his own brokenness in her, another soul tied to a post, waiting for the end. He hadn't bought a victim. He had bought a mirror. And in that shared, unspoken darkness, a fragile, dangerous thing began to take root. A connection. The revelation of the nursery changed the air between them. The silence was still there, but it had a different texture. It was no longer the silence of a predator and his prey, but of two wounded animals sharing a den, learning the shape of each other's pain without needing to speak it. Ida began to heal in small, almost imperceptible ways. She still moved quietly, but her steps were less like a ghost's and more like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping sorrow. She started to cook, simple meals of beans and biscuits, filling the cabin with the scent of something other than dust and grief. One afternoon, she found a patch of stubborn wildflowers growing by the well and picked a small bouquet, placing them in a tin cup on the table. It was the first splash of color the cabin had seen in years. Calder noticed. He didn't say anything, but when he came in for his meal, he paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the purple and yellow petals. A flicker of something. Surprise? Gratitude? Crossed his face before the mask of stoicism slid back into place. He started to change too. He began to talk to her. Not much, but more than before. He'd point out a hawk circling overhead or mention that a storm was rolling in from the east. Small offerings of normalcy. One morning after their silent breakfast, he pushed his plate back and looked at her, his expression serious. "You should know how to shoot." The question startled her. "Why?" "Because this world doesn't care if you're afraid of it," he said, his voice flat. "It'll swallow you whole all the same. You need to know how to make it choke." He took her out to a wide, empty pasture and placed his rifle in her hands. It was heavy, the wood smooth and cool, the metal smelling of oil and power. It felt alien and terrifying. He stood behind her, his presence a solid wall at her back, his voice a low murmur in her ear, as he showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to breathe. "Don't think about who you're aiming at," he said. "Think about what you're protecting." She didn't fire it that day, but she held it. She felt its weight, its potential. And for the first time, she felt a different kind of power coursing through her veins. Not the power of endurance, but the power of defiance. Their fragile peace was building, brick by painful brick. A shared laugh when he tried to bake bread and produce something resembling a blackened rock. A quiet moment on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and rose. The silence comfortable now, a shared blanket against the cold. She was starting to feel safe. The feeling was so foreign it was almost painful, a muscle she hadn't used in a lifetime, now aching as it stretched. But the world doesn't let broken things heal in peace. It was late one afternoon when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon, a single rider moving fast. Calder saw it too. He straightened up from the fence post he was mending, his body going rigid, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the hilt of the knife on his belt. A cold knot of dread formed in Ida's stomach. It wasn't Frank. This rider was too purposeful, too confident. The man who rode into their yard was everything Calder was not. He was dressed in a fine black coat and a clean hat, his boots polished to a high sheen. He rode an expensive-looking bay mare and sat in the saddle with an air of arrogant ownership, as if the entire desert belonged to him. He dismounted, his movements smooth and practiced, and let the reins drop to the ground. "Calder Boone," he said, his voice slick and cultured. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders and being obeyed. "I've been hearing things about you. Seems you've acquired some new property." His eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, slid over to Ida, who stood frozen on the porch. He looked at her not as a person, but as an object, an interesting curiosity he might like to own. "My name is Silas Thorne," the man said, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. "And I believe you're on my land." Calder stepped forward, placing himself between Thorne and the cabin, between Thorne and Ida. His voice was low, a dangerous rumble. "This land is mine." Thorne chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "A common misconception. According to the territorial registry, this entire valley, including this pathetic little plot, belongs to me. A fact I've come to enforce." He gestured vaguely at the cabin, at the fences, at Ida. "And that includes everything on it." The fragile peace shattered like glass. This wasn't a drunken stepfather looking for what he'd lost. This was a vulture, circling, patient and ruthless, ready to pick their lives clean to the bone. And as Ida looked at the cold certainty in his eyes, she knew this was a fight they couldn't possibly win. Silas Thorne's words hung in the air, heavy and toxic as smoke. My land, he'd said, with the casual arrogance of a king. Calder didn't flinch. I have a deed, he stated, his voice a flat line. Signed and sealed by the previous owner, 20 years back. Thorne's smile widened, a bloodless slash in his clean-shaven face. Deeds can be complicated. Old papers get lost. New papers get filed. The law's a funny thing, Mr. Boone. It tends to favor the man who can afford the better ink. He let his gaze drift back to Ada, a slow, possessive crawl that made her skin feel like it was on fire. I'm a reasonable man. I'll let you walk away with your horse. But the girl, she stays. As a, shall we say, a trespassing fee. A low growl rumbled in Calder's chest. Get off my land. Thorne just chuckled. It seems you're not listening. This is my land. He took a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of a fancy-looking pistol holstered at his hip. I'll be back in 1 week with the sheriff to make it official. I suggest you're long gone by then. If you're not, he left the threat unfinished, letting it fester in the oppressive heat. He mounted his horse, gave them one last, lingering look of contempt, and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and dread in his wake. Ida's legs felt like they were about to give out. What are we going to do? She whispered, the words catching in her throat. He's bluffing, Calder said, but there was a crack in his conviction. He stared at the horizon where Thorne had disappeared, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. But Thorne wasn't bluffing. 4 days later, 2 riders appeared. One was Thorne, looking smug. The other wore a tarnished silver star on his vest. Sheriff Hobbs. He was a portly man with a florid face and eyes that shifted away whenever you tried to meet them. Calder, the sheriff said, avoiding eye contact as he dismounted. Mr. Thorne here has filed a complaint. He's got a new deed from the Capitol office. Says this plot is his. It's a fake, Calder said, his voice cold. Hobbs shrugged, pulling a piece of parchment from his saddlebag. Looks real to me. Got all the right stamps. He held it out. It was crisp, the ink black and authoritative. Says here Thorne bought the whole valley in a tax auction 2 months ago. You're trespassing. It was a lie. A clean, legal, soul-crushing lie. They all knew it, but the star on Hobbs's chest made it the truth. You have until sundown tomorrow to be off this land, the sheriff said, finally looking at Calder, his expression a weak mix of pity and impatience. Don't make this difficult. Thorne, who had been watching the exchange with an amused smirk, stepped forward. And as for the girl, he said, his voice dripping with false concern, she has no legal guardian. She's a vagrant. I'd be willing to take her under my protection, Sheriff. Give her a good home, honest work. His eyes gleamed, and Ida felt a wave of nausea. It was happening again. She was being traded, sold, bartered like livestock. That seems like a charitable solution, Mr. Thorne, Hobbs said, nodding eagerly. No! The word exploded out of Ida, raw and desperate. All eyes turned to her. She stood on the porch, trembling, but her chin was high. I'm not going anywhere with him. Thorne's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The girl is clearly hysterical, Sheriff. She needs a firm hand. Calder moved then, a blur of motion. He was in front of Thorne in 2 long strides, his face a thundercloud. You will not touch her. Sheriff Hobbs put a hand on his gun. Now, Calder, stand down. This is the law. This is theft, Calder snarled, and you're his paid dog. For a tense moment, no one moved. The air crackled with the promise of violence. Ida could see the calculation in Thorne's eyes, the anger warring with the desire to maintain his facade of a law-abiding citizen. Finally, Thorne gave a slight nod to the sheriff. Sundown tomorrow, Boone, Hobbs repeated, backing away. Be gone. They mounted up and rode off, their victory assured. Ida and Calder were left standing in the dust, the forged deed a death sentence for the life they had just started to build. They were utterly, completely alone. The law wasn't just failing to protect them, it was actively working to destroy them. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. The silence was back, but this time it was the silence of despair. "We have to leave," Etta said, her voice barely a whisper. "We can just go north. Start over." Calder was cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and methodical. He didn't look at her. "He won't let us," he said. "It's not about the land. It was never about the land. It's about you. And it's about breaking me. Men like Thorn, they don't just want to win, they want to crush you. He'll hunt us." Ada sank into a chair, the last embers of her hope dying out. "So what do we do?" Calder stopped cleaning the rifle. He looked over at the small, rough-hewn chest where he kept his few possessions. The same chest where he kept Clara's things. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then a strange light glinted in his eye. A flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was something dangerous. It was an idea. "He thinks he's beaten us with paper," Calder said, his voice low and hard. "But my wife, she kept everything." He stood up and walked to the chest. "Maybe it's time we found a different kind of paper." He lifted the lid, and the faint scent of dried lavender and old memories filled the room. He wasn't just looking for a weapon anymore. He was looking for a ghost. Calder knelt before the open chest, a time capsule of a life that had ended too soon. He carefully lifted out folded linens, a worn dress, a small collection of pressed flowers. Ida watched, her heart aching for this man and the ghosts he lived with. He was searching for something, a needle in a haystack of sorrow. "What are you looking for?" she asked softly. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "Anything. A letter. A receipt. Something Thorne and his paid-off sheriff can't just forge." He ran his hand along the bottom of the chest, and his fingers brushed against something hard. He pulled out a heavy leather-bound Bible, its pages worn thin with use. This was hers. She read from it every night. He opened it, and a flurry of small, forgotten things fluttered out. A dried flower, a ribbon bookmark, and a single folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a letter. Calder unfolded it carefully, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle. He began to read, his eyes scanning the elegant, looping script. Ida moved closer, peering over his shoulder. The letter was from Clara's father, written shortly after she and Calder had married and bought the ranch. Most of it was fatherly advice and well wishes. But then one paragraph leaped out. "And I rest easier knowing you and Calder are secure. That deal I made with old man Thorne was a stroke of luck. To think he traded you the deed to that whole valley, free and clear, just for a guarantee of half the water rights from that spring I found on the North Ridge. He always did say water was worth more than gold out here. He must never have told his son about it, the arrogant fool." Ida and Calder looked at each other, their eyes wide. A spring, a secret spring, and a deal. A deal that predated Thorne's forged deed by 2 decades. Old man Thorne had traded the land to Clara's father, who had then given it to her and Calder as a wedding gift. Silas Thorne didn't own the land. He never had. His father had traded it away, and this letter was the proof. "He doesn't know," Ida breathed, a wild, electrifying hope surging through her. "Silas Thorne doesn't know about the spring." "Or he does," Calder said, his mind racing, "and he's trying to steal back what his father gave away. This letter, this changes everything." But their elation was short-lived. A sudden, frantic pounding on the door made them both jump. Calder shoved the letter into his shirt and grabbed his rifle, motioning for Ada to get back. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice a low growl. A panicked voice answered from the other side, a voice they both recognized with a jolt of shock. "It's me, Frank Lick. You gotta let me in." Calder exchanged a bewildered look with Ida. He cautiously unbarred the door. Her stepfather stumbled inside, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with terror. He wasn't drunk. He was sober, and he was terrified. "What do you want?" Calder demanded, keeping the rifle level. "He's gonna kill me," Frank gasped, clutching his chest. "Thorne! He sent for me, told me he'd wipe out my debts, give me a stake to leave this territory for good." "For what?" Ada asked, her voice laced with ice. Frank couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor. shame and fear warring on his face. To tell him about you, he mumbled. Everything. Where you came from. That you had no one. He, he was the one I owed the money to all along. Not the saloon. It was always Thorne. He set the whole thing up. He wanted you from the beginning. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Thorne hadn't just stumbled upon them. He had orchestrated this entire nightmare. He had used Frank's gambling addiction to put Ida in a vulnerable position, a prize to be claimed. He'd planned to have Frank lose her to one of his own men, but Calder had interfered. So Thorne had switched tactics, coming after the land itself to get what he wanted. He sent me back here, Frank continued, his voice shaking. He knows you won't leave. He told me to tell you. He's sending men tonight, not to evict you, to get rid of you, to burn this place to the ground with you both inside. The hope that had soared so high just moments before came crashing down. The letter was their key to winning in a courtroom, but Thorne wasn't planning on letting it get that far. He was done with legal maneuvering. He was moving on to fire and blood. The wind howled outside, a mournful cry that sounded like a warning. They didn't have until sundown tomorrow. They had until nightfall. Suddenly, the cabin didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap, and the walls were about to be set ablaze. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Ida's throat, but she swallowed it down. The girl who would have frozen in terror just weeks ago was gone. In her place was a woman who had held a rifle, who had faced down monsters and found her own strength. She looked at Calder, and she saw not fear, but a grim, focused resolve solidifying in his eyes. "Frank," Calder said, his voice dangerously calm. "You're going back to him." Frank's head snapped up. "No, he'll kill me." "He'll kill you if you don't," Calder countered. "You're going to tell him I agree. Tell him I'll trade him. The girl, the deed to the land, everything he wants. In exchange for safe passage for me out of the territory. Tell him to meet me here at dawn, alone, to finalize the deal." Ida stared at him, her heart pounding. "What are you doing? You can't—" "It's a bluff," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "It buys us time, and it gets him here, where we want him." He turned back to Frank, grabbing him by the front of his shirt. "You will make him believe it. Your life depends on it. Now go." He shoved Frank toward the door. The pathetic man scrambled out into the growing dusk, a terrified pawn in a game he didn't understand. The moment he was gone, Calder turned to Ida. "The letter proves we own the land. Frank's confession proves Thorne conspired to kidnap you. But it's our word against his and the sheriff's. We need more." "More what?" "Allies," he said. He strode to the small window and looked out across the vast, empty plains. "There are other ranchers in these hills. May, Eli, folks who've been here for years. Thorne's been squeezing them too, buying up their water rights, blocking access to grazing land. They hate him, but they're afraid of him." "They won't help us," Ida said, the doubt creeping back in. "They'll be too scared." "They might be," Calder agreed, "but they haven't heard your story." He turned to her, and the intensity in his gaze was staggering. "You are the proof of what he is. You are the weapon they can't ignore." He pressed the reins of the mule into her hand. "Take the letter. Ride to May's place first. It's 5 miles east by the Twin Buttes. Show her the letter. Tell her everything. Tell her what Thorne is, what he does to people he thinks are weak. Tell them we're making a stand at dawn, but we can't do it alone." He was asking her to ride out, alone in the dark, into a hostile land, to rally an army. He was asking her to be the hero of her own story. She looked at him, at the unwavering belief in his eyes. He wasn't just giving her an order. He was giving her his trust. "Be careful," he said, his voice softening for the first time. She just nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She mounted the mule, the precious letter tucked safely in her shirt, and kicked the animal into a trot, melting into the shadows. She was no longer a victim being led away from a saloon. She was a messenger, a soldier, riding toward a war. Calder watched until she was gone. Then he turned back to the cabin. The night was growing cold. He had a few hours until dawn, a few hours to turn his home into a fortress. He began to work, barricading the windows, checking his ammunition. his mind a cold, clear machine of strategy. But as he worked, a single terrifying thought echoed in the silent cabin. He had sent the one thing in the world he now cared about, protecting, directly into the lion's den. If she failed, if the neighbors turned her away, she would be alone out there when Thorne's men came looking. And if he failed here, the fight at dawn wasn't just for a piece of land anymore. It was for everything. The ride to May's ranch was a nightmare of shadows and strange noises. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every coyote's howl like a man's shout. Ida's fear was a living thing, a cold passenger clinging to her back. But beneath the fear was something new, a fierce, burning purpose. She thought of Calder, waiting for her, trusting her. She wouldn't let him down. She found the ranch, a small, tidy homestead nestled between two rocky hills. A grizzled woman with eyes the color of a stormy sky met her on the porch, a shotgun held loosely in her arms. This was May. "What do you want, girl?" she asked, her voice wary. Ida's own voice trembled at first but grew stronger as she spoke. She didn't beg or plead. She just told the truth. She told them about Frank, about being tied to the post, about Calder buying her freedom. She told them about Silas Thorne, his forged deed, and his plan to take everything. And then she showed them the letter. May read it, her lips moving silently. She passed it to her husband, Eli, a quiet man with kind eyes. As he read, other ranchers, drawn by the late-night arrival, began to gather. They were grim-faced men and women, their hands calloused from work, their faces lined with the worry Thorne had etched there. When Ida finished her story, a heavy silence fell over the small group. She had laid her soul bare, and now she waited for their verdict. "He's a snake, that Thorne," one man muttered, "but he's got the sheriff in his pocket." "Fighting him is suicide," said another. Doubt began to poison the air. They were afraid. Ada's heart sank. She had failed. Then May spoke, her voice ringing out in the cold night air. "I've lived in this valley for 40 years. I buried a husband and 2 sons in this soil. I will not be run off my land by some slick-suited coward from back east." She looked directly at Ida, and there was a fire in her old eyes. "And I will not stand by while he does to this girl what he's been doing to us piece by piece for years." She turned to the others. "He picks us off one by one because we're afraid, because we stand alone. Calder Boone is drawing a line in the sand. The question is, are we going to stand with him, or are we going to wait for Thorne to come for us next?" Her words were a spark in a tinderbox. A murmur went through the crowd. Faces hardened. Jaws were set. One by one, they began to nod. Ida had done it. She hadn't just found allies. She had ignited a rebellion. Back at the cabin, the first hint of dawn was staining the eastern sky a sickly gray. Calder stood on his porch, rifle in hand, watching the empty horizon. He was alone. Had she made it? Had they turned her away? Had Thorne's men found her? The not knowing was a physical torment. Then he saw them. First one rider, then another, cresting the ridge. Then 2 more. Then a wagon. Within minutes, a dozen armed ranchers were riding into his yard, their faces grim and determined. And riding at the front, on her tired mule, was Ida. She slid off the animal and ran to him, a triumphant, exhausted smile on her face. "They came," she breathed. He put a hand on her shoulder, his heart swelling with a pride and relief so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. "You came back," was all he could say. There was no time for more. A new cloud of dust was visible on the horizon, a much larger one. "It's him," Calder said, his voice like iron. The ranchers took their positions, melting into the rocks and shadows around the cabin, a silent, waiting army. Calder and Ida stood on the porch, side by side, waiting. Silas Thorne rode in, flanked by Sheriff Hobbs and a half-dozen hired thugs. He saw Calder standing there, the girl beside him, and a smug, victorious smile spread across his face. He thought he was arriving for a surrender. He dismounted and sauntered toward the porch, oozing confidence. "Boone, I see you've come to your senses. A wise decision. Hand over the deed and the girl, and I'll forget this whole unfortunate—" He trailed off. May had stepped out from behind the barn, her shotgun leveled at his chest. Then Eli appeared on the roof of the cabin, a rifle in his hands. From behind the rocks, from the tall grass, from every shadow, the ranchers emerged, their weapons all trained on Thorne and his men. The smug smile vanished from Thorne's face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His hired guns looked around nervously, suddenly finding themselves badly outnumbered. Sheriff Hobbs licked his lips, his hand hovering near his gun. "Now, folks, let's not do anything rash." "It's over, Thorne," Calder said, his voice echoing in the sudden, tense silence. "We know everything." He held up the letter. "We know about the spring. We know this land was traded to my wife's father 20 years ago. This is our land. It always has been." Thorne's face went pale. "That's a lie. A forgery. Is it?" Ida's voice cut through the air, clear and strong. She stepped forward, no longer a frightened girl, but a woman forged in fire. "And I suppose the fact that you hired my stepfather to put me in a position where you could claim me as a lie too? The whole town of Dustle saw him tie me to that post. Your plan has witnesses." Thorne was trapped. His lies were unraveling around him. He looked at the sheriff, his eyes pleading, but Hobbs could see the tide had turned. The lawman was looking at a dozen angry armed citizens, who now had proof that he was a corrupt official. In a last desperate move, Thorne drew his pistol and aimed it at Ida. "I'll kill you all." He never got the chance. A single shot rang out, clean and sharp. Not from Calder, not from the ranchers. The shot came from the porch. Ida stood there, Calder's smaller handgun steady in her hands, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. Thorne cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching his hand where the bullet had torn through his palm, sending his pistol flying into the dust. It was over. Sheriff Hobbs, seeing his benefactor disarmed and his own future dissolving, made a choice. He pulled out his handcuffs. "Silas Thorne," he said, his voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're under arrest." Justice, real justice, had finally come to the valley. Not on a piece of paper or from a man with a tin star, but from the barrel of a gun held by a girl who had decided she was done being a victim. The sun rose higher, burning away the last of the shadows, and shone down on a new world. Thorne and his men were tied up, their arrogance replaced by sullen silence, waiting for the long ride to a federal marshal who couldn't be bought. Sheriff Hobbs, in a desperate attempt to save his own skin, was helping, his face a mask of false righteousness. The other ranchers gathered around Calder and Ida, no longer just neighbors, but a community forged in defiance. They clapped Calder on the back. They nodded respectfully to Ida, their eyes filled with an admiration she had never known. May gave her a fierce, proud hug. "You did good, girl," she whispered. "You did real good." As they all began to disperse, heading back to their own homesteads with the promise of a future free from Thorne's tyranny, Ida and Calder were left standing alone in the quiet yard. The air was filled with the smell of gunpowder and desert sage. He turned to her, his face unreadable, and gently took the pistol from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers and a current passed between them, warm and electric. He looked at the fading bruises on her face, the new strength in her spine, the fire in her eyes that had burned away all the fear. "I used to think this place was just a graveyard," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. He looked around at the small cabin, the mended fences, the vast open land. "A place to wait for the end. But it's not anymore." "What is it now?" she asked softly. He finally met her gaze, and the last of the walls around his heart crumbled away, revealing something honest and raw and beautiful. "It's a home," he said. He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You made it a home." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment, savoring the feeling of safety, of belonging. When she opened them again, tears were glistening on her lashes, but they were not tears of pain. They were tears of release, of joy. He had bought her for a handful of coins, a broken thing to mirror his own brokenness. But in saving her, he had saved himself, and she, in finding her strength, had given him back his life. They weren't two damaged souls anymore. They were two halves of a whole, reforged in the fires of adversity, stronger in the broken places. They stood there on the porch as the sun climbed the sky, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with unspoken promises, with the beginning of a love story written not in the stars, but carved out of the harsh, unforgiving, beautiful desert dust. If this story of justice, strength, and redemption moved you, if it reminded you that even in the darkest of places, the fiercest light can be found within, then don't let this be the end of the trail. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove the human spirit can never truly be broken. Hit that like button to let us know you stand for the underdog, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a tale of survival and love on the unforgiving frontier. What part of Ida's journey inspired you the most? Let us know in the comments below. We'll see you in the next story.